All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome everyone to this installment of the Conservation Lecture Series. My name is Whitney Albright. I work in the Science Institute here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife and help to organize the lecture series. Thank you everyone for being here. This is one of our first kind of all webinar lectures. So appreciate you joining and hope you're all staying safe and healthy out there. I do have a few announcements and logistics before we get started. First, you probably noticed that you're all muted. That's to help us preserve the sound quality for everyone and also for the recording. We are recording the lecture and we'll be posting it to our website after today. Because you're muted, we do encourage you to type any of your questions into the chat box, and I will relay those to the speakers. Feel free to type questions in kind of throughout the presentation as they come up, and I'll make sure to get those to the speakers during some of our kind of designated Q&A time. Also, one more thing, we're not streaming any live video this time, so you might notice kind of a random black box on your screen. If you go to the upper right corner of your Skype window, there's several icons up there. The leftmost icon looks like almost a little person in a doorway. If you click on that and select Content View, it will change the view so that you're just looking at the screen that's being presented. So I wanted to make sure and share that. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of one of our first all webinar lectures where we have multiple speakers. So appreciate your patience as we kind of switch back and forth between us and switch over our PowerPoints. And also due to the volume of folks on the line, there may be a little bit of a lag between the slide transitions and the speaker narrative. Both speakers are aware of it and are going to try and pace accordingly, so it shouldn't be an issue, but do appreciate your patience and kind of adaptability as we work through this format. Okay, before I introduce our speakers today, I wanted to mention that we have scheduled our next lecture for Wednesday, May 20th from 1:30 to 3 p.m. And this is a reschedule of a lecture that was originally planned for March and we ended up needing to postpone. So we've rescheduled this lecture for May 20th. We'll be hearing from Allison Young and Rebecca Johnson with the California Academy of Sciences, and they're going to be talking about citizen science and utilizing technology to collect biodiversity data at a large scale. So be sure to mark your calendars, and we will get registration links up for that lecture on our website here in the next few days. Okay, without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce our guest speakers for today. We have Tom Robinson and Dr. Stuart Weiss. And Tom is a principal of Tom Robinson Consulting, and in that role he directs the Conservation Lands Network project for the Bay Area Open Space Council, and he also assists nonprofits and municipalities to plan for landscape health and climate adaptation. And his academic training is in both ecology and geographic analysis. Our second speaker today is Dr. Weiss. Stu serves as science advisor to the Conservation Lands Network, and he has research experience in everything from conservation and population biology, microclimate characterization, and also statistical analysis. And he has worked for over 15 years at the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford University. So thank you both very much for being here, and please give our speakers a virtual round of applause, a virtual welcome. And now I will turn it over to Tom to share his PowerPoint.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here with us today. I'm going to switch over to my computer real quick, make sure you guys can see it. Okay. How are we looking? You able to see my screen? Great.
We can go black. There we go. It came on.
Just came up. Yeah.
Great. Good to hear it. Well, thank you, Whitney. Thank you so much to the Department of Fish and Wildlife for hosting us. We're really excited to be sharing this with you, albeit virtually. Yeah, kudos to Whitney and her team for organizing this, even though we're all at home sheltering in place. Forging ahead with communicating and getting the word out about science during this time. I applaud you guys for. So Stu and I are really excited to talk to you all today about the Conservation Lands Network 2.0. This is a 3.5-year update to a regional conservation vision that we just completed in November. And it really, we think demonstrates sort of the state of the art when it comes to creating a biodiversity-driven conservation vision at the regional scale that local organizations can utilize to essentially coordinate their biodiversity efforts. And what we want to do today is we have about a 60-minute presentation. We're really pleased to have this sort of longer format where we can kind of dive into the data and the science and the species a little bit more than typical, and then leaving plenty of time for questions. And Whitney, I just want to thank you in advance for monitoring the chat. Please chat your questions. We have 2 spots in the middle of the presentation, or at various spots in the presentation where we'll stop and answer questions. So Whitney, thank you for that, and participants, thank you for including your questions. So we have about a 60-minute presentation. We really hope that this sort of firmly not only puts the Conservation Lands Network framework in your minds, but I hope that we make an argument for conservation planning at the regional scale, and that it's a very sort of appropriate and necessary scale. And we kind of want to make the case that perhaps the regional scale, the multi-county scale, is maybe the appropriate synchro between local implementation and the state's wonderful objectives when it comes to biodiversity. I'm thinking in particular of the Biodiversity Initiative, but so many other initiatives. So I hope we have a robust discussion at the end of this presentation. And I want to just mention that everything that that we're going to present today is at bayarealands.org, and on that website you can download reports, data. You can play with our Explorer tool that allows you to sort of interact with all the data, and I'll show you screenshots of that in a second. To begin, the Conservation Lands Network was first launched in 2011. That was 1.0, and between 2017 and 2019, we updated the entire framework through a process that we call CLN 2.0, the Science Expansion Project, which included expanding not only the amount of data and science that that are sort of incorporated into the CLN, like climate change, but we also expanded the geography. Before, the CLN only touched the 9 counties of the Bay Area, or the 9 counties that touch the Bay, but this time around we've included Santa Cruz to sort of round out that ecoregion. And the geography of the Conservation Lands Network is the upland habitats of the San Francisco Bay Area, which for our purposes, as I mentioned, is the 9 counties that touch the Bay and in Santa Cruz. As many of you know, California is a biodiversity hotspot in and of itself, but as this map shows, that the Bay Area is perhaps one of a handful of unique spots in California, which means that we have a lot of plant and animal species that call this place home. And nearly all of the pre-European contact species are still here, which is the wonderful news. The bad news is are they all doing well? No, not all of them. Climate change, first we've converted a lot of their habitat to other uses. And climate change is already adding pressure to the region's ecosystem. And we have more people on the way to this region. Our local Metropolitan Transportation Commission, our planning organization, estimates that the Bay Area is going to add an additional 2.1 million people by 2040, which would bring us to 9.3. So this is a really good time to get strategic about which habitats and lands we are going to ensure are conserved in perpetuity. And so the CLN is based on the idea that what we need is an inspiring vision that focuses the conservation efforts of the region, and where we have all the boats, all the land trusts and open space districts and park departments and water districts and so many other organizations, RCDs. We're all sort of rowing in the same direction and working toward the same vision. But what we also need is an accounting framework to track and communicate our progress over time. This is increasingly important, and as many of you are state employees and staffers and leaders, you understand that you have a lot of regions, a lot of localities that you need to track and understand what they're doing. And so we can help you by creating quantitative frameworks that show progress over time, not only our local investments, but state investments as well. And so that's where the CLN comes in. It sets a goals-driven vision to conserve 2.5 million acres of priority lands by 2050. That's the overarching goal, and that's about half the Bay Area. And why 2050? 2050 is when experts tell us that the effects of climate change will be acutely felt. So we can see this as a call to get sort of our house in order over the next 30 years. And you may ask, is that doable? Is conserving 2.5 million acres doable? We want to argue that yes, it is. We've protected already 1.4 million acres, and so we need an additional 1.1. And by conserved or protected, what we're talking about there is not just parks and preserves, but we're also talking about working lands and ranches with conservation easements. But this is the trajectory over the course of 7 or 8 years, and if you extend that trend line, we are slated to hit 2.5 right around mid-century. Now, the large parcels out there are becoming fewer and fewer. So what we would need to do in order to meet this goal is to rely on policies that achieve the goals as well. But we think it's doable. And we're interested in promoting not just this idea of 2.5 million acres, but 2.5 million acres of the right, the right places, the places that represent the full diversity of habitats that exist in this region. And not only that, but we want a connected network that has the right amounts and in the right configurations. So let's take a look at the region through the lens of the Conservation Lands Network to just sort of demonstrate what I mean by this network. So what you're looking at is about 4.8 million acres of terrestrial land, and about 1.5 million acres have already been converted, either as cultivated land or urbanized land, which leaves 3.3 million acres of natural or sort of semi-natural land. And as I mentioned, about 1.4 million acres have been conserved as parks, preserves, and working ranches with conservation easements, which leaves about 1.9 million acres of unprotected or unconserved land. The Conservation Lands Network, which is a geographic analysis, if you look at the remaining blue areas there, it's about 1.3 million acres, and what we think of these as just strategic opportunities that hopefully drive conservation toward this toward a connected network. And what you can think about here is that the blue areas, and as we'll demonstrate in this talk, those represent a full suite of habitats that exist in the Bay Area, and in an efficient configuration in an appropriate amounts. And so what we're driving toward is essentially hoping that the 1.1 additional to get to 2.5 would come from these strategic opportunities. So how do we get to those blue areas? This was sort of the heart of the analysis for the network. The first step is to kind of break up the region into different geophysical settings. And this is sort of a conservation planning 101 type thing to do in order to localize what you're prioritizing. So we call these in conservation land speak, or conservation lands network speak, landscape units. And they are comprised of natural geographic areas like valleys, mountains, and low hills. And what they do is they serve to sort of disaggregate the network design, so that as we analyze the different habitats, we're actually creating a mini network for each landscape unit. We'll talk more about that in a bit. We start with our mapped natural vegetation communities, and then we combine those with the landscape units, and we get multiple combinations. We get well over 1,200 different combinations there. So these combinations serve as what we call the coarse filter conservation targets. Now, just stepping back briefly, this whole framework is based on the coarse filter, fine filter conservation planning approach, which says that if you start with a broad representation of habitats, like a vegetation map, you're going to get, roughly 80% of your conservation targets in that region, just through these habitats acting as proxies for other species. And so we call these the coarse filter conservation targets, which and we're going to need fine filter conservation targets, which I'll describe in just a second. But this is how we get it. We get these coarse filter conservation targets, such that blue oak, for instance, in the Blue Ridge Berryessa landscape unit, are not competing with the blue oak woodlands in the Russian River Valley landscape unit. And the reason why we want to do that is as our network design software is going to be looking to create this very optimized, very efficient network. And if it thinks that it can achieve all of the blue oak woodland goals by keeping them all in, by selecting areas in Napa, then it probably will not select those areas as small areas in the Russian River Valley. And so this highlights the importance of sort of disaggregating the network design so that these small patches of blue oak woodland in the Russian River Valley don't compete with the much more prevalent blue oak in the Napa, in the Blue Ridge Berryessa range. And each one of those 1,200 plus targets were ranked by our vegetation focus team. And so if we were to zoom in, I just chose the spot in Santa Cruz County, and it's located in the South Santa Cruz Mountains Landscape Unit, we would see some rank 1s, rank 2s, and rank 3 habitats. This is what our focus team did. They looked at each one of these coarse filter targets, and they ranked it based on rarity and importance. And so, for instance, a rank 1 here is knobcone pine, a rank 2 is California sagebrush, rank 3 is redwood. Redwood's actually quite prominent in Santa Cruz in this landscape unit. And then rank 4s are urban or cultivated, and they actually don't achieve a goal. But this is how we do it. The 90%, for rank 1s, we're looking to achieve 90% of that target within the network for this landscape unit. 75 for rank 2s, 50% for rank 3s. And just wanted to highlight, this is sort of the accounting, part of the accounting framework here is, here are our 3 different example coarse filter conservation targets here. And we start with total acreage. We multiply that total acreage by that percentage value. So rank ones are going to be 90%, and then we get the total acreage goals. We figure out what's been conserved already, and then we get our acreage to meet the goals, and then we have an accounting of the acreage within the network itself. And this is a map of the distribution of the different rarity ranks, and as you can see, very few targets were ranked as rank 1. Here's a breakdown of the proportion of the Bay Area by rarity rank. So for instance, rank 1s really they constitute only 3% of the Bay Area, rank 2s 12%, and rank 3s 50%. And here are some examples of the different types of what qualified as a rank 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay, so as I mentioned, coarse filter conservation targets only get you so far. There's lots of different targets out there that aren't well mapped in a regional vegetation map. Things like ponds or large complex forests. Some vegetation maps, eVeg is the source that we used primarily for the vegetation map. That's by the U.S. Forest Service. And there is quantitative information in there, but we were able to use LiDAR-based information in the Bay Area to identify large complex forests. And so we actually included that as a fine filter target because the distribution was better in that LiDAR data set than it was in the eVeg, which is not surprising because LiDAR is very accurate and in fine scale. But we have lots of different fine filter targets. Those were just two examples. We had, rare plants and spotted owl areas, and we relied heavily on the CNDDB and other products from the Fish and Wildlife Department, and including data sources from local biologists as well. And again, it's equated to 1,700 different fine filter targets occurrences. So the next piece to all of this modeling is our analysis unit, and we used hexagons. And for folks who are familiar with the areas of conservation emphasis program there at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, hexagons probably won't look strange to you. It's an excellent summarizing unit, 6 sides, and the trick is to pick the size of the hexagon. So we're going to summarize all of our information and into these different hexagons, and the modeling that we use, which is Marxan. These are the bits that Marxan chooses as it starts to assemble this efficient network. So here's what it looks like. We use 250 acres or 100 hectare hexagons. 250 acres is a good estimate for a typical land conservation project in the Bay Area. And so this sort of mirrors one of those types of projects. And for each one of those analysis units, we calculated a cost index. So this is based on population density, distance to roads, parcelization, and this goes into the model to sort of bias the network toward more intact, less disturbed areas. So bringing it all together, we start with our landscape units, and we have our vegetation types, and we get our coarse filter conservation targets. Then we get our 1,700 fine filter conservation targets, which are all ranked. And we merge the rankings, our existing protected areas, and our cost layer. Those are fed into Marxan, and Marxan produces like I said, an efficient, low-cost network. And the idea is that Marxan is trying to reduce the cost and achieve all the goals. In fact, we're forcing it to achieve all of those acreage goals and those occurrence goals. It's not trading off sort of one set of goals against another. We're really sort of forcing it to achieve our goals in the most efficient way possible. We end up with our draft network of selected areas, and we have a couple of steps to sort of refine the network. We remove conserved areas, and we added a couple of enhancements to the network. The first is adding stream valleys. What are typically called riparian areas are actually sort of underrepresented in vegetation maps, as some of you may know. And what's most important to the riverine systems is actually not just adjacent vegetation, but really the whole stream valley, because over time that stream is going to occupy all places along the floodplain, and it's going to create habitat as it sort of does that over large time scales. And so we want to prioritize and conserve that whole space. So we modeled stream valleys and added them right into the network as high priority areas. And so here's a kind of a schematic of the area that we targeted for modeling stream valleys. So it includes the floodplain, the terraces, and even edging into the upland fringe. And here's an example in Napa County on Childs Creek. You can see there the floodplain in the photo, the terrace, and the upland fringe. Here's a look at the topography and terrain. And so we feel really good about this. This is something that is new, and it gets us away from buffered lines that don't necessarily capture the areas that we want to capture. And so those were added right into the network. The next thing we wanted to make sure is that the network itself was connected. So we ran a least cost paths analysis to make sure that the disparate patches of the network are connected. And we added those areas in as what we call connectors, or areas that ensure network connectivity. And it added about 110,000 acres to the network. Not a huge amount, but network designs need to be connected. And as we all are becoming aware or already know, that connectivity is incredibly important. This isn't habitat connectivity, this is network connectivity, but we're promoting this network as a conservation vision, and so we want to build in that connectivity. We'll talk about habitat connectivity in just a little bit. So all of that is to say that we end up with this spatially explicit network design that feeds or fuels or drives the vision for conserving 2.5 million acres in the Bay Area by 2050. And we are by no means saying that the areas that are not within those blue areas are not worth anything. They absolutely contribute to the goals. All of those areas have one or many conservation targets within them. But what we're really trying to do is sort of push the question, if we were only able to conserve X amount, or in this case 2.5, where should those 2.5 million acres be? So yes, to complement sort of the network, we also wanted to add in stream conservation targets as well. So we have habitat conservation targets, we have species occurrence targets, and then we also have these stream-based conservation targets. And they're based on, we have 3 priorities. Priority 1 is the presence of coho salmon and inland steelhead, including adfluvial rainbow trout. Priority 2s are presence of inland native fish and coastal steelhead streams. And then priority 3 are all other streams, because they're just so important. And our sources are local fisheries biologists, Rob Leidy's reports with the Cal EPA, and various recovery plans, including the states. So I just want to go through a little bit more about how we're leveraging this information. So it's all well and good to have ranked all these habitats, to have designed a reserve, or a network design, But I mentioned on the outset that we also want to use all of this as a way to communicate progress over time. And that's a function that is very valuable at the regional scale. A lot of our conservation partners at the local scale perhaps don't have the wherewithal to sort of roll up all of the work that they're doing and their partners are doing, and also, what adjacent counties are doing to achieve conservation goals. And so we at the Bay Area Open Space Council, which is the steward of this whole framework, and Bay Area Open Space Council is actually transitioning to a new organization called Together Bay Area. And so you'll be seeing new branding for the organization and for the Conservation Lands Network as an aside. But this is a way for us to leverage this information for all of the folks at the local level. So let's go back to that Santa Cruz example where we have our four cover types as examples. And we're just going to talk about the rank 1, 2, and 3 for a moment. And so we've gone through, we've ranked them, we've come up with their goals for this area, and then we can see how much of these different conservation targets are already protected. We were seeing that California sagebrush is actually already 95% toward its goal of 90% in this landscape unit. Redwood forest is 59% toward its goal of 75% because it's that's a rank 3. So 59 toward its goal of 50%, and so on and so forth. And here's how the accounting frame works. Every so often, every year or 2 years, we will go out to all of the different land conservation organizations in the Bay Area and ask to get their latest their latest protected areas database, and we'll aggregate those together and run the analysis again and see how we're forwarding these goals. And so this is an actual example of taking a temperature reading between 2011 and 2018, and during that time we achieved California sagebrush goals. We made some serious progress toward redwood and not so much toward knobcone pine. So this is very strategic. This is good information. We can pan out and look at the whole region and ask, where are we making really great progress on these different conservation targets? And we can also ask and answer who and what activities have led to these advances. So for instance, blue oak foothill pine woodland increased by 12% in that time period to 63% toward its goal. And then we can look at those actions, and we find that the Napa Land Trust and Save Mount Diablo's activities largely led to those increases, and so on and so forth. We can do the opposite of this as well. We can ask, where are we as a region sort of continuously underserving certain habitat types? So alluvial riparian is an example. And Oregon white and black oak are two other examples where we're really haven't kind of broken the 20% threshold. So this can focus our efforts. We can talk about this to our publics, our boards, our funders, that there's work to be done in these areas. These are underrepresented in our conservation network. And so the Conservation Lands Network 1.0 and now 2.0 has a really important role in the Bay Area region. It's the upland complement to two other conservation planning frameworks, the Bayland Habitats Goals and the Subtidal Habitats Goals. And these are planning frameworks that are really driven by the State Coastal Conservancy's mission. And over time, these plans have been updated and with new science. And so the Conservation Lands Network 2.0 is the process to sort of update the upland component. Conservation Lands Network reports, you can run a report to get all this information that I'll show you in just a second, but these reports are requested by the primary funders in our area, the Bay program of the Coastal Conservancy, and the San Francisco Bay program of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And we're hoping, if there are any granting agencies on the call today, we're hoping that you'll see these reports as well. And we're hoping that this webinar will kind of get it on your radar screen, and that you understand sort of the framework that these local organizations are using to sort of figure out what the regional importance of their projects are. The CLN is also the criteria for terrestrial ecosystems in our MPOs, our Metropolitan Planning Organization's Priority Conservation Areas program. And the CLN is also the biodiversity inputs or components to the Bay Area Greenprint, which you can check out at bayareagreenprint.org. Okay, so just a few more slides about the Conservation Lands Network 2.0 process. We most certainly did not do this in a vacuum. This was no fewer than 100 different volunteer practitioners and experts joined us in this effort to update all this information and to run these analyses. Here's our steering committee. We also convened a vegetation focus team. So we were able to grab Todd Keeler-Wolf before he retired. That was wonderful. And others. We had a fish and riparian habitat focus team. Folks from the state were on that focus team as well. We had a mammals focus team, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and invertebrates. We convened a policy, funding, and land use planning focus team, stewardship focus team, and a rangelands focus team. Rangelands are incredibly important in the Bay Area. About 40% of the network is working ranches. We also had a cadre of peer testers and reviewers as we put content out, particularly our web interfaces. These folks reviewed and gave us feedback. And all of this is sort of encapsulated in a report that we hope that you take a look at bayarealands.org. There's a lot more in there than I've just presented, so I encourage you to take a look at that. And in there, the steering committee of the Conservation Lands Network 2.0 came up with some 5 overarching goals, or 4 to complement the 2.5 million by 2050. I won't go into these in great detail, but they have to do with landscape resilience. That's sort of one of the main focuses of the Conservation Lands Network, and it being a network itself is actually an adaptation or a landscape resilience action or activity itself. And it's one of the no regrets strategies for increasing landscape resilience, of course, is having a backbone of conserved land that people and species can rely on as the climate warms. In the report, you'll also see chapters on each one of the flora and fauna taxon, and we have lots of information about each of those species, the status, and conservation concerns. And all of this, as I mentioned, is at bayarealands.org. You can download the report. You can use an online mapping tool called the Explorer to get conservation portfolios for specific areas. It could be a property, it could be a watershed, it could be a conceptual area conservation plan. Oh, somebody chiming in? Oh, okay. You can also, at bayarealands.org, take a look at a county level dashboard of how we're doing toward those 5 goals, 5 overarching goals that I just mentioned. And then if you are a GIS practitioner, you can download a massive GIS database with all of the Conservation Lands Network 2.0 data formatted in an ArcMap project. And as you use the Conservation Lands Network, I just want to highlight that we have a feedback button on the Explorer, and so as you're tooling around with it, please give us your feedback. We'd love to hear how it is helping you or something that you would like to see improved. So at this point, I'm going to pause and ask if there are any questions. Actually, I'm going to turn to you, Whitney, to see if there are any questions have come through that we can handle in the next 5 minutes.
Yes, so we have a few questions in the chat, which I'll just read those off to you one at a time. The first question is, how does an area become protected/conserved?
Just answering briefly, what the definition we're using is some sort of activity that results in that piece of land being conserved in perpetuity. So that could be a fee title acquisition or a conservation easement. Those are the two primary tools. Those are the two primary tools that we're using right now to equate to conserved. Great question.
Okay. Next question, is this going to be expanded to the rest of the state?
There are not plans to do so right now, but as I said on the outset, we're really hoping that this sort of inspires other regions. And we're interested to see and talk with the Fish and Wildlife folks about how this complements their framework, the Areas of Conservation Emphasis framework, which does cover the state. So there's already a statewide process. Interesting to see if any of these methods are of value to ACE or vice versa.
All right, we've got a couple more here. Is the focus more on protection via acquisition or easement, or is restoration of degraded habitats also the focus?
Stu is going to talk about that in just a second, but do you want to give a brief?
Let me pipe in, is that we also view the stewardship and restoration of habitats as kind of a necessary condition for really considering biodiversity to be conserved. And one thing is that all of the stream valleys are part of the network, no matter how degraded they are because of the geomorphology.
Yeah. Maybe one more question?
Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple that are similar, so I'll maybe summarize those. I think you touched on this a little bit already, but what specific definition of protected are you using? Does the land absolutely need to be under conservation easement, or are public lands owned in fee title at a county or city level also considered to be protected?
Great. Yeah. Thank you for doubling on that one, because I left out a key piece. So we did go through sort of a filtering process. So certainly county level parks were included, but city level parks that are largely sort of managed grass, ball fields, exactly. Yeah, golf courses, those kinds of things were not included. And off-highway vehicle areas were not included either. So that's kind of a state holding that we didn't include into as a conserved area that sort of helped form the backbone of the network design. So those were not included for obvious reasons. I think the human activity in those areas, city parks and off-highway vehicle areas, kind of preclude them from being considered safe harbor for species.
All right. Well, we've got a few more questions, but I'm happy to save those for the next kind of Q&A break if you'd like to keep going. It's up to you. Okay.
I think let's charge forward and we'll answer questions in just a bit.
Okay.
Good.
So this is Stuart. I want to say hello to all of my friends and colleagues out there who are on the call. And I'm going to.
Control. There you go.
Okay. So we're going to 3 frequently asked questions. What does the CLN say about biodiversity at the species level, because I think a lot of us are thinking about specific taxa. What do we offer about climate change and landscape resilience? And how can CLN strengthen the case for conservation in general? So what does it say about biodiversity at the species level? Well, it says a lot, and I'm going to do a quick whirlwind through some of the highlights that came out through the discussions with our focus teams. Okay, so in the endangered and threatened plant world, there's a lot of very interesting stories. This is the coast yellow leptosiphon, which was listed as endangered under the California Endangered Species Act in 2017. A beautiful little annual plant, and that photograph is showing the entirety of its habitat on a coastal bluff near Half Moon Bay. We think this species really represents risks of sea level rise and coastal retreats. There's been a lot of emphasis on what happens around San Francisco Bay, but on the outer coast, every foot of sea level rise can lead to 50 to 150 feet of coastal retreat. So that's an issue we think needs a lot of attention. Moving along. We noted the return of the river otter to large parts of the Bay Area. Let me go back up there. Having a through the citizen science of the river otter the river otters have reoccupied a lot of streams and creates a lot of interesting issues with
Stu, would you like me to just advance slides for you?
Yeah, I think that'll be the best. I'll just say next.
Okay, you got it.
So let me give control back. Release control. Okay. Yeah, there's like one too many steps there.
Sure.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so river otter has returned. Let's keep moving on. The next slide. Okay, so beavers are returning to a lot of river systems in the Bay Area. They really are ecosystem engineers. Advance, please. And they're really transformative for riparian habitats, fish and other creatures. And there's some thought that they may be the key to coho salmon recovery. We are experiencing the camera trap revolution, so we know a lot more about the distribution of mammals in the Bay Area. This is a western spotted skunk, which is quite rare in the Bay Area. Next. We've fleshed out its distribution. This is a long-tailed weasel, very cryptic species that likes very dense shrublands. This photograph was taken from San Bruno Mountain just south of San Francisco, and it was a surprise to see a creature like this on such an isolated habitat. Next slide. Badgers have been getting a lot of attention. They live at very low population densities in grasslands and really, really need the connectivity across valleys, like the population in the Santa Cruz Mountains. There's currently a study going on, is highly isolated, and maintaining the connectivity is essential in the long run for a thriving badger population. Next. This is the Santa Cruz kangaroo rat, and the camera traps have identified a couple more inaccessible scrubby habitats where we still have Santa Cruz kangaroo rats. One of the rare mammals in the Bay Area. A lot of work done at culverts. This is here we caught a bobcat and a badger, and I'm sure everybody has seen the coyote and badger video from the Bay Area. That was taken by the Peninsula Open Space Trust. That was the most viral wildlife video of the year so far.
Mm-hmm. And Pathways for Wildlife.
Yeah, Pathways for Wildlife. Next slide. This is a long-tailed weasel coming through a culvert. I threw this in both to illustrate culverts, and then that is a really cute picture of a weasel there.
And I think Ken Hickman sent us this one.
Yeah.
Thanks to Ken.
Yeah. Thanks to everybody who sent us photographs. And then the puma. So the Santa Cruz Puma Project has really revolutionized our knowledge of how pumas use the landscape. Absolutely critical for wildlife connectivity to maintain the puma populations. And with the recent advancement of the Bay Area, South Bay and East Bay populations of puma under the California Endangered Species Act, it gives us, extra oomph in making sure the pumas can freely move in and out of the Santa Cruz Mountains because of the genetic issues that were identified by an excellent study. Next slide. Okay. Anybody in fisheries know the coho salmon are in crisis. There's a really comprehensive recovery plan that I believe has been updated already. Next slide. And there's official recovery plans for all three anadromous salmonids. Rob Leidy brought our attention to these adfluvial trout that use reservoirs for feeding and then run up the creeks to spawn. So they're trapped away from the ocean, and it turns out they maintain the original genetic stock despite artificial stocking programs in a lot of the streams, is that these fish have persisted. And the original genetic stock of rainbow trout is incredibly important. So we upgraded those streams to priority 1 to draw attention to them. Next slide. The burrowing owl has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. It likes short grasslands, thrives in grazing lands where you have a lot of ground squirrels. Next slide. Advance. Turns out the Bay Area is a major overwintering population, especially in the South Bay. And summer breeding habitat is more restricted, but the role of the Bay Area's overwintering habitat really came out when we started talking with our bird focus team. And burrowing owls are covered by the major habitat conservation plans and natural community conservation plans, so they're a natural target. Foothill yellow-legged frog, it's a stream dweller. We identified watersheds that support foothill yellow-legged frog are known to. I think there's a lot more survey work to be done. And this species is covered by HCPs and NCCPs, and also just recently got California Endangered Species Act listing. Okay, next slide. Going into the insect world, we have the mission blue butterfly, where there's active translocations taking place to repopulate places like Twin Peaks in the middle of San Francisco. A lot of habitat restoration, and it really brings forth the issue of native scrub control and seeding in host plants. It's representative of coastal grasslands that are being overtaken by native scrub encroachment and with the loss of the grassland biodiversity. Next slide. The monarch butterfly, turns out the Bay Area supports somewhere on the order of 30% of the overwintering monarch butterfly population, which has, as you can see from this graph, has collapsed in 2018 and in 2019. So we're responsible for these groves of eucalyptus trees and other trees that serves the overwintering population refuge. Next slide. And of course, there's a lot of breeding habitat in the milkweeds that are scattered among the grasslands in the Bay Area. So making sure that the non-overwintering generation has food, and that the butterflies leaving the overwintering grounds can encounter sufficient host plants for that first generation. Really, really critical for the whole western monarch migration. Next. This is my favorite, the bay checker spot butterfly. It's a major focus of the Valley Habitat Plan in Santa Clara County. It's driven a major acquisition on Coyote Ridge, and it's really a poster child for nitrogen deposition impacts, where the smog is fertilizing our grasslands and is being managed by grazing. And there's been a series of reintroductions of the bay checker spot butterfly with some success to repopulate areas where it's disappeared. Next slide. A lot of the notes that we took are in Appendix C in the species and habitat targets, notes and management issues. It's a really good place to start if you're curious about some of these taxa. Next slide. Okay, so what do we offer about climate change and landscape resilience? Advance. Okay, so mitigating and adapting to climate change, maintaining clear pathways to suitable climate and habitat as the climate changes and the sea level rise. That's having large connected areas of protected open space is the key there. Next slide. How resilient is the landscape, which is a combination of how diverse it is in terms of local climates, and then how well can is especially important in the South Bay. Next. Yeah, we looked at the Bay Area Critical Linkages Project, which is a functional connectivity model using least cost paths. We also considered a new product called Omniscape, which is a structural connectivity model that provides multiple paths, and I feel like it's a better representation of the way connectivity really works, getting away from narrow least cost paths. And again, this was provided by our friends at the Nature Conservancy. Next slide. Oh, so yeah, we wanted to call out some of the connectivity projects, linkage projects in Coyote Valley, Highway 17 in the South Bay that are pretty well advanced. There have been major acquisitions and infrastructure improvements. And then up in the Sonoma Valley area, connecting Sonoma Mountain with the Mayacamas, a very well advanced linkage project there. Next slide. Yeah, connecting upland and bayland conservation in an era of sea level rise. The boundary is changing and it's moving upland. So we identified shared bayland and upland strategies for climate resilience. Next slide. Sediment delivery down our streams is really critical for maintaining marshes. Having the high water refuge areas on the uplands is also really critical. So that interface becomes very, very important. Next. And we actually mapped out the bayshore where we still have natural land as opposed to built in urban lands, and these become the absolute critical areas for allowing the sea level to rise and let, not have to protect built areas. So.
And Stu, I just want to jump in and say that we created a map, but we certainly didn't do the analysis. I just wanted to give Brian, Full Frost and Thompson credit for this data.
Yeah, thank you. Next. So, and then lastly, we did a vegetation vegetation vulnerability to climate, to drought. So we took our vegetation types, we overlaid onto that the climatic water deficit, which is an integrated measure of drought stress that takes into account climate and soils. We did that overlay. Next slide. And then for each vegetation type we got the profile of climatic water deficit in which we find it. So in this graph, we have various oak communities, and you can see that black oak and Oregon oak have a lower CWD threshold. We decided to pick the 95th percentile as a benchmark, and when we created a metric, that's how far away from that threshold you are. So for Oregon oak, the 95th percentile is 813. For blue oak, it's 945. So blue oak lives in much more arid environments than Oregon oak does. Next slide. So we created this map that shows across the Bay Area various levels of vulnerability. This is scenario neutral. We don't have to pick a particular climate future. It's just looking at existing conditions overlaid onto a very robust trend of climatic water deficit increase because of truncated rainy seasons and higher summer temperatures. Next slide. And this projects loss, not replacement. We don't know necessarily what's going to come in. We're just able to say that these are stands that are close to the edge of their climatic comfort zone and are more at risk.
And that's important to land managers because they might have a stand of vegetation that they want to see persist, and so they'll want to focus in on hydrologic connectivity to those areas, making sure they're wet and connected.
Yeah, and this makes a lot. The analysis makes a lot of biogeographic sense. If we go to the next slide, I have an example in my backyard in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So this is the east slope of the Santa Cruz Mountains near the town of Woodside. You can see the texture of the redwood forests here. The redwood forests are in blue, and there's also a mixture of live oak, woodland, and mixed hardwoods. And then when we look at the risk map we produced, you can see that the redwoods that are coming down the hill at the eastern fringe are higher risk than those on the west slope. So it's actually getting down to almost a stand level as a hypothesis of here's where we want to look for vegetation stress and potential for transitions sooner rather than later. Next slide. In the Explorer reports, we had report on vegetation risk and landscape resilience and connectivity. So we extract information about your area of interest. Next.
Great. Thank you, Stu. I'm going to take over from here and wrap us up. The third question is how can the CLN help strengthen the case for conservation? You know, one of the things that we wanted to do with CLN 2.0 was get sort of beyond biodiversity. We know that land conservation organizations and the state, really everybody who's focused on the land, understands the need to tell a broader story about the values and benefits of the land. So we have this in the conservation portfolio reports that you produce using the Explorer tool. We have several metrics that people can use to make the case for conservation, and we call this the sort of the beyond biodiversity page. And in it, you'll find information about recreation and how visible a spot is, or what its food production value is, or how can conserving this land perhaps reduce risk to, conserving and stewarding the land reduce risk of fire or flooding to communities. How much carbon is stored in a given place, and is it a part of a water supply for people? And so we're getting lots of this data actually is from the state, and so we just want to take a moment to acknowledge the really great data that is coming out of the state, and so we've kind of operationalized it here at the property scale. So, for instance, if you're on the Explorer tool, you run a report, you can get information about recreation. So here's just an example in near Petaluma. This is a property that's near several other parks. It has a variable amount of visibility from populated places and major roads. I know I'm quite familiar with Sonoma County, and I know that the visual character is really important to people here, as well as, it's important to everybody, but people want to know how visible a piece of land is for aesthetic reasons, and so we've kind of built that into the Conservation Lands Network reporting tool. Food production, here's an example. We're using FMMP and the Story Soil Index, gives you a sense for does it qualify for farmland conservation program? And then we leveraged a whole bunch of data put together by folks at Greenbelt Alliance, Adam Garcia in particular, to get a sense for the policy landscape out there. And so, for instance, this example patch of land that I just randomly chose in Petaluma, there's watershed policies that apply to it. There's a critical streams policy that applies to it, and then there are other policies that are around it. And this is just really important for conservation planners and practitioners to know what the policy context is in a given area. So that is, I'm actually wondering, just given the time, actually, no, we just have a few more slides after this, just about kind of some final thoughts. So let's go ahead and pause right now for questions, because that was quite a bit of information that we just presented. So Whitney, do you mind tossing some questions our way?
Sure, yeah, we've got several in the queue, some from earlier and then some that came in during Stu's presentation. So I'll just start at the top here. There's a couple questions here around what activities are considered to be compatible with conserved areas or protected lands. And so I saw a couple questions about specifically about general recreation, recreational harvesting, and camping, and whether or not those are considered compatible activities.
Yes, for the purposes of this study, those are considered compatible. So, for instance, the Mount Diablo State Park is for sure compatible. I know that there's ways to get sophisticated, through gap analysis and others, but that might be something that we look at in the future. Thank you for that question.
Next question, how do you define connectivity? Is it a certain width? And do you include the needs of carnivores such as mountain lions?
Another really great question. So the network itself it's sort of agnostic in terms of the needs of a particular species. And so that's why we have bundled those other connectivity products that Stu described, the critical linkages project that did, mountain lion was a focal species for those functional corridors, which look at the specific needs of species. And then the Omniscape is agnostic in terms of species. It's more of a structural, how well does a patch of land, facilitate movement of seeds and individuals. So the short answer is yes, we've bundled information that includes, movement needs. Part of that, the critical linkages was an area, the core areas that the corridors or the linkages are connecting are large. They have to meet a very large threshold, 50,000 acres, in order to be a core habitat, which is kind of on the scale of mountain lion range needs. Next question.
Next question is, would degraded urban streams, i.e. channelized, be incorporated?
Well, the CLN, the whole framework is really about, improving integrity. But as you guys probably can tell, it starts with what do we have left, and let's make sure we get the sort of the best of what's left, and that's included. What we do have in the report is an estimate of what stream areas have been degraded, either fully urbanized or cultivated, and maybe encroached on. There's an estimate, and one of the ways that we can think of that data set is how can we turn those degraded areas into functional areas. So that's another area of improvement that I think we can look at, is how do we use the data in the same way that we're using the habitat information as an accounting framework? How can we use this new stream valley data as an accounting framework? How are we doing against particular stream restoration goals? That's an area I think we can move into. Great questions. And Whitney, I'm hoping we can copy and paste, if we can, let's make sure that we don't lose these great questions, because I think they deserve us revisiting and maybe writing or blogging about. So that would be great too.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, we can save the conversation chat and make sure to get that to you. Okay, shall I keep going with a few more here?
Yeah, let's do one more. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Next question is, have you considered how you could use the Department of Fish and Wildlife Regional Conservation Investment Strategies Program, or RCIS program, or the Natural Communities Conservation Planning Program, which I think you mentioned, NCCPs, to help incentivize getting funding for your goal?
I'll take a stab at that. Those are both really good programs that are targeting high biodiversity areas. I've done a lot of work with the Santa Clara Valley Habitat Plan, which is an HCP, NCCP, and we're totally seeing the advantages of having that framework in terms of attracting outside investment, providing kind of a platinum standard for stewardship and adequate stewardship funding. We also have the East Contra Costa plan. So those are, we feel like those are really, really critical components for implementation that are very specifically targeting the imperiled biodiversity in the Bay Area under the legal framework of the Endangered Species Act and the Natural Communities Conservation Plan. So we're gung-ho on HCPs and NCCPs.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in really briefly about the RCIS. I think there's some really strong data connections with the CLN and the RCS. There's two pilot RCIS projects in the Bay Area, and both of which are leveraging CLN 1.0 data, and hopefully they'll update their frameworks with CLN 2.0. But in terms of a full integration, I think there's work to be done there. It's a great question. But certainly on the data front, RCISs in the Bay Area are kind of, ingesting, I think it maybe is the best word, the network itself.
Yeah, and like the accounting framework, maybe moving forward, we can attribute certain acquisitions and easements to those processes and keep track of it within the broader context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great question. Okay, well let's march forward just a couple more slides, and then we'll take the remainder for more questions. So just a couple of notes on implementation. It's one thing to have a vision out there like this, but the real where the rubber meets the road is what our local implementers are doing. So obviously, as many of you surmised, this is a vision that should serve functions of open space districts and land trusts on ongoing acquisitions. Land trusts, just in terms of they are typically fast moving, and they're playing this really wonderful interim role in some cases where they are able to take advantage of opportunities and then transfer land to land management agencies. Working lands easements, California Rangeland Trust really is a champion of working land easements. Mitigation lands, as Stu was just mentioning, HCP, NCCP, I think Stu just kind of spoke right to this, that the CLN can and is supporting our local HCPs in the Bay Area. The directors of both of those HCPs were on our steering committee.
Tom, we're losing you a little bit.
Oh, okay. Am I cutting out? Is that
with I think your phone might be cutting in and out a little bit.
Oh, I'm going through the internet. Okay. Stu, how about you? We want to take over?
Okay. Yeah, sure. And then there are policies. Hello? Do you have me?
It sounds like we're having the same issue with Stu. Oh, maybe it's just me. People are saying you sound fine. You guys keep going. Okay. Apologies.
Okay, well, then there are existing land use policies. As Tom mentioned, we have some of those. The Green Print has compiled a lot of that. And these are policies that prevent or slow development until, if it's really valuable land, permanent protection is possible. And then there's kind of de facto protection because of remoteness and ruggedness, natural hazards. It's places where there's not development pressure. Then the big issue of stewardship, we didn't really have time to get into it, but protecting against the conversion is a necessary first step, but biodiversity is not going to take care of itself in our rapidly changing environment. So, we want to bring forth the issue of how do we ensure there's sufficient expertise and funding to implement effective stewardship. We discussed this in CLN 2.0. Chapter 9 of CLN 1.0 report outlines a lot of specific resource management issues. So we're standing on the shoulders of CLN 1. So ongoing initiatives, like I said, HCPs and NCPs, California Stewardship Network, 1TAM, various other, these informal local networks of private ranchers, friends of groups for parks, and then working on permitting needs, and then a real call out to the resource conservation districts, which I think are the glue that can hold the stewardship landscape together. And there's some happy California cows protecting bay checker spot butterfly habitat.
Great. And then looking maybe up one scale, looking at the state, I think the Conservation Lands Network supports many of the state's objectives with respect to the biodiversity initiative, its resiliency work, safeguarding California, greenhouse gas reduction goals, sustainable groundwater, farmland, strategic growth. We think that if the CLN doesn't, perfectly match all of these objectives, it's still forwarding them in significant ways. And we hope to refine the ways in which the CLN can act as sort of a regional synchro between the state's objectives and local implementation. How can we help the local implementers intersect with state objectives with respect to all of these efficiently and really kind of help everybody achieve their goals. So that's one of our priorities going forward. And with that, we just want to thank you again. And it looks like we've got about 7 minutes for questions. But before we do that, I just want to acknowledge, Stu is as our science advisor. He's our continuity with CLN 1.0. I want to thank CLN. Stu said it great. We're really standing on the shoulders of that team. Ryan Bransifort and Nancy Schaefer. And all of the steering committee and everybody who was involved in CLN 1.0. Want to acknowledge the Bay Area conservation community for helping us with 2.0, and a shout out to Kathy Switke, who edited our report and did just a fantastic job. And of course, I want to acknowledge generous funding by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the California State Coastal Conservancy. Without their help, none of this innovation or help or strategy would be possible. So thank you to them, and once again, thank you to Whitney and her team at the Department of Wildlife for hosting us today. So let's continue hearing from folks.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll keep pushing through and get in as many as we can. I'll kind of jump around a little bit to try to get a range of questions here. The next one is, what is the current ratio of public versus private land in the Bay Area? And do you find that private landowners in the Bay Area are amenable to being approached about opportunities to conserve their properties?
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, that really gets to the implementation. Well, to the first question, it's about 30% has been conserved so far. And so we're looking for that remaining 20%. And it really, it depends on where you are. I think, the Bay Area has a spectrum of private landowners in terms of their amenability to conservation opportunities. I think the short answer is that clearly there's a conservation ethic in the Bay Area, and that's why you see so much of the Bay Area already conserved. It's not just Point Reyes National Seashore and the various state parks and legacy projects. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of private land conservation in the Bay Area. Particularly, in the North Bay, there's a lot of conservation easements Marin County, Sonoma County, Napa County, Solano County, where the amenability to conservation opportunities and is probably, I mean, this is a little bit of an anecdote, anecdotally, just from my experience, probably at an all-time high. And that's just a testament to the trust that is being built by our, land trusts like Marin Agricultural Land Trust, Sonoma Land Trust, Solano Land Trust, Land Trust of Napa County, and the RCDs. So we need to keep that trust going and keep giving private landowners a fair shake and an opportunity to stay on their land, but not and stay in the region and not have to sell out because it's so expensive to operate. Great question.
All right. Next question here is for Stu. Could you elaborate more about sediment delivery? Do you have a layer for sediment in the Conservation Lands Network, or are you finding that the prioritized areas under the network tend to have better delivery?
Okay, yeah, that's a really tough question. No, we don't have a sediment delivery map. I know that those have been generated for some of the TMDLs. We have a lot of sediment impaired streams.
Sedimatch too.
Sediment, yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of work with sediment. The Bay Area, tectonically active, erosive landscape, so there's naturally a high sediment load that gets greatly exacerbated by poorly planned and maintained roads and culverts. Trying to, maintain sort of a natural background and deal with the excessive sediment, the fact that all of our stream valleys are considered to be part of CLN is where a lot of the natural sediment delivery process is taking place. So allowing the sediment to flow where possible is really kind of a very central part of that stream valley targeting.
Just chime in and just say, we really point folks to other entities that are doing a lot more work on matching, sediment hungry places with sediment delivery places in the report.
Great. Well, it looks like we're coming up on noon here. I want to be mindful of our presenters' time. We do have a few more questions, so if you'd like to stick around, we can address those, or I can save them and send them to you, you guys, after the lecture, depending on timing. But if folks do need to drop off, feel free. What is your time looking like? Do we want to take a couple more, or
yeah, sure.
do we need to go ahead?
Yeah, we'd be happy to. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. We've got just a few more here, so I'll pull those out.
Mm-hmm.
Next question, do you have thoughts on connecting to the Central Valley via watersheds like Cache and Prutaw Creeks and others over to the Sierra Nevada foothills?
Yeah, that's definitely, well, we've just been so focused on the Bay Area, so there hasn't been much talk or action, but it does make a lot of sense. And there are also some sub-regional projects that are, extending beyond the Bay Area. Thinking in particular of the Mayacamas to Berryessa project of the Pepperwood Preserve. But in terms of this framework, extending it beyond the Bay Area, it's good to hear that people are asking that question. But we don't have plans to do it, but we should start talking about it.
Yeah, I want to just a little anecdote. I made a verbal presentation of this to the Strategic Growth Council, and Denny Grossman said, well, we're happy to have Stu because the Conservation Lands Network is the Cadillac of conservation plans, which made me feel good. But I quickly corrected him and said, no, this is the 21st century, so it's the Tesla.
Yes, right. That's right. Humility is also a virtue of the Conservation Lands Network too. So.
All right, let's see. Next question, would an agricultural easement count towards protected lands? Grazing is often used as a form of management on conservation lands. Also, land for raising cattle might be beneficial for burrowing owls and other species.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's been a real revolution with the relationship between the conservation and the ranching community in the past couple decades with the California Rangeland Conservation Coalition. And it turns out cattle grazing is like absolutely essential for a lot of the imperiled species. It maintains grasslands without excessive growth and thatch that's exacerbated by the atmospheric nitrogen deposition from the smog in the Bay Area. Creates habitat for ground squirrels that then are kind of ecosystem engineers, and the burrowing owls and the salamanders, and then the maintenance of stock ponds are absolutely critical for California red-legged frog, tiger salamanders, and a whole range of species. So we're really, really pro responsible ranching, both to maintain the ability to graze our public lands when they're needed, and then maintaining a critical mass of the ranching community so that that service can be maintained.
And that compatible land use as well can be sustained. That's right. I would just mention that some conservation easements that were sort of wall-to-wall cultivated agriculture, we did not include into the Conservation Lands Network, just because there's just habitat has been sort of removed from those areas. But some areas that have some vineyards or some orchards or row crops were included because the habitat has not been completely removed from those properties. But it was a low proportion of the property being cultivated. So not wall-to-wall vineyards, those kinds of conservation easements.
All right, just a couple more here. The next question, I think, is asking if you did or incorporated any wildlife and urban conflict mapping, like incidents or resolutions?
We did not. No, it might just be a little bit out of scope for this project, but it's certainly an issue.
Yeah, the connectivity across major highways with our pinch points and choke points, that's been informed by a lot of the roadkill records and camera traps. But one of the things we try to do with CLN is steer the conserved lands away from where there already is a large human impact.
Unless there's something super high priority, where the network can't achieve those goals elsewhere. Yeah, but I think also just the idea of dogs off leash and mountain bike. Some of these things that once you get down to the park scale are management issues for sensitive species. The CLN is not able to really address those from a data standpoint, but we do address those in the various species chapters. We account for the fact that there are certain species that are being subsidized by human trash, like crows and ravens, and they have a negative impact on other species because they're more fit and are able to take over more territory and predate other species. So we do discuss those at a kind of a taxon level, but it's not sort of addressed in the larger network data structure. Just wanted to mention that. Okay,
next question here. think you might have touched on this earlier on. How do you find out when lands are protected? For example, do you have someone looking at title reports to see if a conservation easement has been placed?
We rely on, so Together Bay Area, formerly the Bay Area Open Space Council, is a membership oriented and membership driven organization and maintains really strong relationships with the various land conservation organizations in the Bay Area. And so it's as simple, really. I mean, I know it's not terribly simple, but we have these contacts and we email the data providers at the individual organizations. And so in that way, it's very comprehensive. Is it exhaustive? You know, are there out of region conservation organizations that are recording easements? Yes, there certainly are. There's, you know, that happens. And in that way, what we're relying on are the local conservation practitioners to keep their ear to the ground, and then we roll up all of their data into what's called the Bay Area Protected Areas database.
And it looks like we have a comment here too in the chat building on that the Natural Resources Agency has a conservation easement tracker that may help, and they just updated it, and WCB and other information is also included there.
Wonderful. That's great. Good. Yeah, good to know. And we coordinate with Green Info Network, which manages the California Protected Areas database. And I would imagine that there's an intersection there with Green Info as well.
Okay, well, we have one more question here. Are you evaluating sustainable ranching and carbon sequestration benefits?
Well, Stu, do you want to chime in on that one?
Well, we present above ground carbon storage, which is a little bit different because that's such a fluid field at this point. We didn't feel like we had the data to support stuff with presenting things about soil carbon. And we were very, very interested in it in terms of being a conservation incentive. You know, the sustainable ranching, you know, from our experience interacting with the range managers and the ranching community, is that the current ranching methods are pretty sustainable. You know, that the era of overgrazing is largely gone, and things like you know, a really good incentive for restoring riparian areas, for example, is the carbon sequestration, in addition to just creating much better habitat in degraded areas, and also the filtering of nitrates from the water. So you know, there's a lot of possibility for you know, integrating that in. We did not have the data at this point to, you know, seriously incorporate it, but the potential is great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems like a very rapidly evolving field. So lots of new information coming out there.
So things like, you know, things like compost amendments have, you know, potentially great value, but, you know, working out the details of where and when to apply it and avoiding the high biodiversity areas, or understanding what impact it does have on native grassland biodiversity. You know, those are all rapidly evolving areas of research and questioning.
Mm-hmm. To say nothing of the evolving relationship between ranching and endangered species conservation. The Bay Area has several ranches where one of the primary functions of the ranch is to provide habitat for pond-dwelling endangered species. And those ranchers are, ranching both beef cattle and endangered, habitat for endangered species. So that's an evolving and an interesting dynamic happening in the Bay Area and elsewhere as well, with respect to.
I mean, a really good example of that is in the Alameda County RCD has a whole pond program.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, I really want to call out the RCDs. We had several RCD members on our various focus teams and steering committee. And as far as getting her done out in the field, both with public and private lands, the RCDs are an incredible resource that are very poorly known outside of the conservation community.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I think we've got to all of the questions in the chat. So I want to go ahead and wrap us up here and just thank you again, Tom and Stu, for an incredible presentation. I'm realizing that I knew very little about the LAND network going into this, and this is extremely informative and helpful. So great presentation. Thanks for being here, for being so flexible with the format and staying on extra time to get to all of these questions. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for joining and for hanging in there. We had several final comments here, just saying fantastic work to you guys, and thank you. I'll read this last comment. It says, fantastic work. I see a great deal of congruence and complementarity with our areas of conservation into this project, and looking forward to a deeper dive and potential dialogue and data sharing going forward. So thank you to you guys.
Wonderful.
Yes, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and please don't forget to mark your calendars for our next lecture on May 20th, and we hope to see you then. So thanks everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you all. Take care of yourselves.